That works. That's something. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Look at our attendees flowing in. Hello, hello. Okay. Look at all our friendlies coming in. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Hi, Mike. Hi, Brian.
Hello.
How's everybody doing today?
Doing great.
Yeah, doing quite well.
Samesies. Let's do this. All right. Great. I think we're just about ready to kick off. Let me just check. We are recording. So welcome everybody to our Data Monetization 101 event. I would like to thank you officially for joining us. My name is Kalia Garrido and I head up marketing and events here at Great Data Minds, which is now a Haiku company. So Great Data Minds is a collective of passionate data activists, and we are on a mission to modernize the world of data. We do this in two different ways. The first is that we have our services arm. This is our strategic planning, education, and the deployment of critical data projects. This happens at hike2.com. In addition to these data services, Hike2 is a fully functional, best-in-class innovation consultancy that specializes in digital transformation strategy, design, and implementations. Now, when it comes to our data and analytics community, some of the content that we create in our conversation, just like the one that we're going to have today, you can find more about our events on hike2.com/events. You can also find us on Eventbrite at Great Data Minds, and all of our recordings will always be showing up on YouTube. So we highly suggest that you go and follow us over there. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. This is a webinar, of course, so your cameras and microphones are off, but as always, we encourage conversation and engagement via the chat, via the Q&A, and we'll also reserve a little bit of time at the end of the session if you'd prefer to raise your hand and you could ask your question live. So allow me to do some introductions for my presenters today. First, we have our special guest, Brian Reynolds. He helps to lead the embedded analytics go-to-market team globally at ThoughtSpot. He's got a bunch of years of experience working for industry leaders in data and analytics, such as with Tableau, Accenture, Starburst, and Good Data. Brian has helped businesses of all sizes, from seed stage startups to Wall Street banks, tackle the challenge of delivering information and insights to their customers. Brian, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
We're happy you're here. And then, per usual, we have Mike Lampa, my partner in crime. He is a seasoned data expert in digital transformation, focusing on modernizing enterprise data and analytics programs. He's got over 20 years of experience, and he excels in implementing advanced technology tools and platforms. His expertise and dedication drive successful transformations, empowering organizations to thrive in the digital era of which we are absolutely living. Mike, thank you for being here, and I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Kalia. Brian, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great. It's nice to see you again, Mike. How have you been?
Likewise. I'm doing all right. Doing all right. Crazy days today, but those are good days, right? So, yeah, let's talk about this whole monetization, right? There's a lot of content published out on around data monetization and data democratization. I mean, the likes of MIT Sloan, Gartner, McKinsey, ThoughtSpot, Snowflake, and ourselves at Hike2. What would be your, like, if you were to give a elevator pitch or your collective definition around data monetization for the folks on the call?
Sure. I mean, you can Google it, you can look it up. There's lots of different, definitions of it. I tend to like Gartner's, which is data monetization refers to the process of using data in a quantifiable, beneficial way, either with external or direct methods, including sharing data to gain beneficial terms or conditions, offering informations and product services, etc. It goes a whole lot longer. What does it actually mean? It's basically, can I sell my data and make money out of it, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes for our customers, and actually the majority of our new clients here at ThoughtSpot are actually using us embedded in their client-facing products and services. Sometimes they monetize that. Sometimes they charge for it. Like straight up data monetization some of our customers are lucky enough to have a data set that's just been sitting on the, kind of digital shelves, and they have an aha moment. This could turn into a new revenue stream for me. Sometimes it takes that shape or fashion. Other times it's a little bit more simplistic. It's just basically giving their customers better access to their data to increase, customer satisfaction and decrease churn. But when I think of kind of pure aspirational data monetization, to give you one customer example of that, well, I've done work in the past with one of the major airline engine manufacturers, aviation company, and they've been around for a long time. They have airplane engines. Over time, those turned into connected devices via black boxes, and they really had all this information really to sell warranty and service contracts back out to the airlines. And then one day they had the bright idea that they had all this information about how all the pilots are actually operating those airlines. If you know anything about planes, they take a lot of gas. Gas is expensive. So they had a light bulb where, wow, we can see which pilots are being most efficient, and we can see which pilots are being least efficient. What if we could help the airline save some money on gas? So what they did is they embedded some analytics on top of that data that was literally just sitting there kind of collecting dust. And they turned that into, in their case, an 8-digit revenue stream for that company. And it was a no-brainer for the airlines to buy it because there was an immediate ROI, right? So in that case, there was data. They used some embedded analytics like ThoughtSpot to unlock the value of that data, and it had a clear and present ROI for their customers. So it was a no-brainer. Not everyone has that. Not everyone can start with that, kind of the value of the data. And sometimes you have to just put it out there and to see what the value of that data is and kind of what is monetizable. So that's just one kind of client example that when I think of like having done this for lots of different clients, lots of different places, that's the one where it was like data, analytics, revenue. It was pretty cool.
Yeah. I like a couple of thoughts that popped into my head, Brian, while you're talking. Was first of all, 8 digits in revenue. Oh my gosh, I mean, that's cash. Excuse me, coming in the door. And monetization in its simplest form is really around how can I get an exchange of value? If I start to offer, it's not just data. The point I wanted to make is the analytic insight on top of that data. Which is why I love the work we do with you guys around ThoughtSpot Embedded. But data in and of itself is like, if I get a bunch of rows and columns of data, what do I do with that, right? But if I get insights like what you did with the letting the airlines know which pilots you might want to coach to be a little bit more fuel efficient, that's where you start to get the true exchange of value there. Because you don't always have to sell it, right? But if there's this acknowledgement that you're providing these insights I never had before, and I'm able to take action on those to produce a better outcome, that's a value I'm getting. And the exchange could be I'm going to pay you money, or it could be that I am going to become much more loyal to you, and you don't have to worry about retaining me because you've created stickiness for me, which is equally important. Couple examples in the financial services industry, for example, McKinsey put out a pretty cool report, their global banking annual review report for 2024. And one of the things that they called out was that analytics as a revenue generating value-added service is gaining traction in the financial services industry. And in some cases, banks that are utilizing advanced analytics, they're seeing an increase of the fee to revenue ratios of up to 40%. So on top of the normal revenue the bank is getting, they're getting these service fees at a 40% ratio to the regular revenue, which is a pretty huge lift. And the examples they're using is like cash flow forecasting for small to medium banks, right? They're seeing somewhere between 5 and 10% service fee income by offering these services to their customers. But the thing that I found even more interesting is those SMB customers that are using these cash flow forecasting services, they're 25% more likely to remain loyal to that bank. as opposed to moving to somebody else. So you're getting the stickiness and you're getting the revenue. So there's a lot of different forms that I think are available for you to really turn your data products into something that can enable the insights that are going to generate true, meaningful value to your customers, which is the whole key.
Yeah, I totally agree, Mike. Like sometimes things are just monetizable off the bat, and you just happen to have that data set and you happen to know it. Oftentimes you don't. Maybe the looser and frankly kind of maybe more realistic definition to me of monetization is using your data really maybe in a less glamorous way, but to increase that customer retention, increase that GRR, right? So that being new customer revenue growth minus the churn. And almost every company can increase adoption by giving their customers better access to their data and services. The other thing that happens is as you put your data out there, you get that product feedback loop, right? So you can see the value, and almost always product leaders have a hypothesis of what they think the kind of the valuable nooks and crannies of their data are. And as you make that available to your clients and customers, they start asking questions you weren't anticipating. So you get that feedback loop, which can then be inputs to in the future. If you want to have kind of a monetized or package model with a good, better, best, you can get some of those inputs to see where is the value in your data and what levers can I use to charge more for certain aspects of it.
Exactly. Yep. I love that. Yep. I think that you're starting to you opened up the kimono to start talking a little bit more about what do we mean in our industry around product. We're talking about data product and analytic products. I got a feeling we'll get into that in a little bit. Yep. So the next kind of thought process that we had is there's an equal amount of equal volume of content published around data democratization. Harvard Business Review, Forbes, Informatica product, software product providers like Informatica and Alteryx and whatnot. But when I'm thinking about how to compare and contrast democratization versus monetization, there's a lot of content out there that talks to it, but what's the interaction or the compare and contrast on that? And my thought there, Brian, is democratization. That's essentially providing ubiquitous access to data for the people that have a need to work with that data to generate some insights and identify areas where they can improve outcomes, right? And of course, that ubiquitous access comes with governance controls and whatnot. And usually when we're thinking democratization, and when I read a lot about people's point of view around it, it's primarily internally facing to your organization to help the business domain leaders figure out what can I do to improve the performance of sales or order delivery or customer service, right? But democratization can also play into when you offer it out to your customer supplier ecosystem. You're not necessarily getting any kind of true dollar on there, but you're improving the throughput of your supply chain by sharing the proper data. So if I'm a retailer and I'm sending demand signals to my suppliers, that helps them figure out their supply that they need to have in place for us to be able to get my product in time to build my end state product to sell to my customers. So and when I think through democratization and I start talking about monetization, do I have to democratize the data in order to monetize it is a big question that often comes up. And my sense is because when you subscribe to the principles of true product development, so you start to look at your data sets as not just a set of information, but it's a product of information that is reusable and leverageable, and it doesn't only contain the content of the data, but it's got the published access methods. How do I get to the data? How do I know that the data is properly governed and in compliance with all the regulations that are changing every moment? Um, and how do I make sure that I got the right security and access controls? That all has to be built in as part of the product, right? Um, so if I want to monetize a product, kind of stands to reason to me that you want to make sure all those principles are built into the data product that you're about to generate money on. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. At the end of the day, we're talking about data access and kind of data in the format to the end user, depending on their level of sophistication, can get the so what out of it. So one is doing all the things you just said, like creating those data products, putting them out there. Sometimes democratization might be putting that data out there and it's accessible via API, and then it gets absorbed into somebody else's ETL process or absorbed internally. Generally, democratization, I think, is thought of as just an internal scenario, but I think it can be just as much externally. And that kind of goes back to the end of the last point I was saying is like, if you make that data available and accessible to your clients and customers, you might be surprised about some of the value of that data. As an example there, one of the things that we've seen, I've been selling business intelligence for a long time, and, I've seen self-service 15 years ago when it was more like kind of dashboarding and PDF reports, and then we moved to things like, kind of true data visualization tools like Tableau and Click, where it did get a little bit closer. It moved the access some of the data out of kind of the central IT down to the line of business. But now, the last 2 years with companies like ThoughtSpot, when we take some of those advancements, and you take our pedigree, in our case, our founders came from Google. Everyone, regardless of their level of sophistication, knows how to use Google. And then you apply things like ChatGPT and natural language search on top of that. And then the barrier to entry for any user to have access to the data and ask questions how they think, not as a data engineer, and get the value out of that data. So some of it is just providing access. Some of it is making that data consumable in kind of the right time, right place. And you know, self-service has always been kind of the goal. And I feel like we're actually kind of on the precipice of that, where for 80 or 90% of the users who may not be all that data literate, they can still get in and ask questions, because we're used to having really good data democratization access in kind of our personal lives, on our, on our personal financial services or banking accounts or things like that. But then it used to be we just kind of had a lower expectation for our work apps, whether that's an internal one or a product or service you subscribe to. Now those are, I think, becoming parity, right? That consumerization of business apps is really getting there.
Yeah.
And I can give you a customer example of that. One of our large customers is CWT, which is one of the largest corporate travel companies in the world. They initially thought the people that would access their data when they started democratizing it was going to be about 10,000 total users. So basically, and they've got 5,000 customers. So they thought they would have about 2 users per customer. But when they made that data ubiquitous and put kind of a nice UI UX on top of it, where it was easily accessible to the average user, they now have deployed ThoughtSpot embedded on top of their product to more than 1 million users across 5,000 customers. So the surface area and the value of their data is just way bigger than they were anticipating. And partially because partially that was driven by that democratization, and that had a profound impact on their GRR and churn. In the first year that they did it alone, 16 extremely dissatisfied customers who had very kind of negative NPS or net promoter scores actually came back, and they were to generate a 7-figure increase of kind of saved, if you will, customers who are frustrated by their lack of access to data.
Right, right. And I'm seeing more and more, and predominantly because we're doing a lot of embed work for ThoughtSpot. But these companies that are sitting, they've been a service provider for an industry or a functional area within an industry. So they're like claims processing. Um, these companies are adjudicating and processing claims and figuring them out for insurance companies, and they're doing this on behalf of all the major carriers, right? Well, they stood back and it was like, we're sitting on an industry's worth of data. We can not only provide insightful analytics back to each of our carriers, but we could also start to help them understand where they're sitting with their peer groups. Yeah, because these customers usually have to go out to third parties to get a feel for where am I in the market, am my performance versus market. Now they have one of their service providers that are providing those value add insights on top of it. To me, that's huge, right?
Yeah, that's when I see, I see lots of people build lots of different products using kind of features of ThoughtSpot, plus features of their products or service and their data. And that concept that you just talked about, kind of peer benchmarking and how am I performing versus, 14 other of my peers who also happen to be clients of yours. Here's a sales price, here's their performance. That type of data is probably the biggest lever that I see that people use to, that type of data, competitive data like that, with some nice searchable, usable analytics on top of that. That is a super common and typically super successful monetization strategy for data products.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I could go on and on with the different service industries I'm seeing, taking advantage of it. There's one group that processes all the financial transactions and customer insights and customer reviews and feedbacks for restaurant chains. Fast service restaurant, quick service restaurant, I think is the term for that sector of restaurants. So they looked around and said, we're sitting on an industry's worth of data, right? So they're now offering, analytics back to their customers, and they're going to tier it, to your point earlier, put the product out there, get feedback from your customer advisory board oriented customers, the ones that are say, hey, I love working with you guys. You can throw beta at me. I'll give you feedback because I understand it takes a while to, and then from that feedback, they start to say, okay, I'm getting stickiness. And it almost reminds me, Brian, of when Toad came out in the data and analytics industry. It was a free tool and DBAs loved it, right? And now I think it's like $2,500 a year to have your little single Toad license. But that's a very elegant way to put something out there and see if it sticks. And
Yep.
once it does stick, how do I start to say, well, I've got people that, don't take that Toad out of my hands, right? So, okay, I won't, but, you're going to have to pay for it now. Yeah, that's kind of a nice approach for, it's almost, correct me if I'm wrong, that's kind of a component of product management strategy, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, maybe thinking about key things that I see, like maybe top 5 things that I see people do and how they tend to monetize their data with things like embedded ThoughtSpot. Some of that, and frankly, this isn't ThoughtSpot specific. This is just how do you provide analytics on top of data and bring it to market. What I've seen in general is if you can do it in a kind of product-led growth way, where you're not giving your customers, like as a baseline, one, give more to get more. So you need to give your customers access to the data in a very usable way. And the more you give them for free, the more they are likely to opt into kind of a premium model. Whereas if it's totally just kind of, you've got a gate behind it, or it's totally sales led and they can only access this data product once they've talked to a salesperson, they can't get their hands dirty. Sometimes those tend to be more expensive data products when you think of packaging, but the adoption rate generally, I would say, isn't as high. So if there's a way to do it in a product-led way, where you're giving them a time-bound access to that data with really nice, embedded UI, UX, hopefully powered by ThoughtSpot on top of it, those tend to have the highest level of adoption. I would also say it's one thing to have data that you probably know the value of it, but you probably 100% don't know all the value of it. It's another thing to build a product on top of it and have some nice analytics on top of it. But a lot of folks kind of stop there. Like they build the data product, they put it out there. But a lot of companies I work with, including banks or, insurance brokers, things like that, they need to have really nice competitive analytics products, because if you're an insurance broker and I could sell 5 different types of insurance, I want to use the one whose product kind of gives me the best access to the data, in addition to paying the highest commissions, of course. But you need to really give them access to that, but also it may be that if this is a new data product in your service or your industry, you guys aren't in the practice of selling data products. Don't assume your existing go-to-market and marketing and sales teams are going to know how to sell data products, because it's just kind of a different motion. So that is, I'd say, one step that I see people skip quite a lot, in one area that we offer kind of a lot of coaching and in consulting with, is not just how could you build data products and here's kind of the ways that you could do some of the pricing and packaging, but how can you upskill your team or figure out you need to bolster your team with the types of folks that can help you guys sell these products and services, which a lot of people don't think about that till they put it out there.
Yeah, no, that's a great astute observation, because if I'm in a services industry and now I want to sell data and analytics products, I just moved into almost a software house, right?
Yep.
And those disciplines, I mean, there's so much you got to think about. If you're going to step into offering software, which is what we're talking about here, I'm going to package up data and then I'm going to enable access to that data. At the end of the day, we're building software, and we're using great products like ThoughtSpot and Databricks and whatever to make the realization happen. But there's a lot of things you got to think through. It was like, as part of being a software house, do I have a support model that's going to delight the customer? Am I ready to take feedback and act upon it? Did I think through all the telemetry, all the detail or metadata about the utilization of my products? Have I thought through that? And have I embedded that into my software solution as well? Because I have to see which things are heading towards becoming obsolete, so that I can make a decision. Is it time to retire this data product and upsell the customer to a new product? Or is it time to engineer another release of that data product? How do I know if I don't have a good insight on how stickiness the product's being used and who's using it under which conditions? Right? And the other key thing, most software houses, they might have great software, but if they don't have a killer customer service experience, right? So establishing that, that effective and very responsive customer feedback loop, encourage your customers to provide feedback, and then have that influence your engineering group to issue releases that demonstrates my voice was just heard as a customer. I told you I needed this key feature. You took it under advisement and you looked around. You did the analysis of your market and saw, wow, this customer just gave us an insight into an area that's going to differentiate us even more.
Yeah, and oftentimes those, whether it's a support ticket or your customer service reps, or if your organization has like a customer success team, those are going to be your kind of folks in the field, or your folks for the early warning signs, and you'll start to see the patterns of, oh, this is the type of customer that actually would pay for this premium data product. So definitely would second that, and maybe come back to a point you said earlier that I would reiterate is, get this in front of your CAB, your customer advisory board. If you guys have an early access program, you probably know who those customers are who have lots of opinions on way to improve your product or service. Some of them will actually pay more for more data if you give it to them. And then, like, maybe secondary to that is, don't let perfect get way in the way of good here. But put it out there. Don't think you need to have all of the pricing and packaging completely nailed, because oftentimes you don't, like, people ask questions you're not even thinking about. So, I have a lot of people that do have kind of a good, better, best model, or sometimes like a 5-tier model. And one of the nice things about ThoughtSpot is, while we have lots of different kind of capabilities, you could turn us into like a basic user versus a power user. We don't charge you differently for that. And so sometimes people go, in my opinion, a little bit, they try to gild the lily a little bit too much, and they have like 6 different price points or SKUs or things like that. And it's a combination of our features plus how frequently the data is refreshed, or how far back the data goes, or additional data sets or things like that. I'm a big fan of, like, create a better and a best to start. Give them some good stuff in the better to start with, and then you'll get more folks to upsell into that best, especially if there's some competitive kind of peer benchmark data like we were talking about before. We've seen people do really well with that.
Yeah, and thank you for that little note around don't let perfection be the enemy of good, right? Which brings me back to, we're constantly preaching minimum viable product. Put something out there so you can get feedback, right? Because you're not going to figure it all out. And if you try to do that, you're going to fall into the woes of the early, late 1900s, early 2000s into the second decade of 2000, where people were trying to build, boil the ocean, build the ark, and they had no clue if it was of any value to anybody because we didn't do that continuous incremental delivery of value, get the feedback, refine it, put it back out. Yeah. Could go on talking about this forever. One point I'd like to make too is a lot of times we're inside, the data and analytics group is an IT kind of centric function, although it's starting to become more of a co-development function as self-service capabilities find their ways into the hands of the power users. But as an IT shop, I am serving my organization, and in some shops, depending on leadership, they treat their domain owners as customers, right? But they're not a software development house, right? And then I turn around and it's like, you know what, guys, we're going to sell our products to our customers. We're sitting on some really cool stuff. Don't underestimate the importance of really start to understand what does it mean to be a software house versus a IT services house, because that will come into play as your products get more and more traction and popularity. Yep. Don't want to be caught by surprise.
100%.
So I don't know about you, but let's go see if the folks have some questions for us, because we could keep rambling for hours.
So I do have a question coming in. I have, let's see what it says. Is monetization limited to selling data and analytics to our customers? Monetization with quotation marks?
Sure. You want me to take that one, Mike, or you want?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, no, I'll follow up.
So I would say no. I think using data to increase your customer satisfaction and making sure that your customers continue to stay loyal and with you is a way that you're using your data to affect your revenue. So, and frankly, like I focus on kind of our global embedded analytics, whether that's a huge bank, financial services software company, or Apple Computer, everything in between, you name it. The majority of folks that are embedding us and monetizing us are doing it that way. Kind of aspirationally, everyone wants to have this glamorous, amazing data set that you just put out there, and all of a sudden this brand new revenue stream. Some folks can get there, some folks can't get there. Just giving your customers better access to the data so that they continue to pay more and spend more year over year. Whether you do that as a kind of a separate product or separate offering that you charge for, or you're just getting your customers to spend more because giving them access to the data then kind of creates a flywheel effect where they're buying additional products and services for you. Those are two ways, like churn and kind of that flywheel effect, that more people are monetizing data that way than creating kind of distinct new data products that are new revenue streams.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that too, Brian. If you can realize direct dollars, that's awesome, right? Because I can show I sold this product to this customer and I now get $1,000 a month, right? Times 100,000 customers, that's a lot of revenue. But typically the starting point to get to the point where you got those products commanding that kind of exchange in value in terms of cash, is you have to think through the more indirect impact on your organization around, to your point, I'm retaining customers, right? And I'm seeing this uptick of that needle's moving in a positive direction. I'm seeing less and less churn, which is a positive thing. But how do I how do I connect it back to the fact that it's been since we've been offering these products, outside of just putting it, as of a timestamp, you can infer, but it's not true, it's kind of a correlation, but you have to kind of take a lot of things on faith. If we go back to what I was mentioning earlier around that telemetry, if you're tracking people's utilization of these products, then you start to have a tighter set of underlying leading indicators that says, since we've been doing these products, these customers that are using these products continuously as the product was designed, they are also in the same cohort of customers that are not leaving us. They've gotten more sticky with us. And as that plays on, then you can start to move in. I know you really like this thing, but time to charge you. And then when you go down that path, you have to start thinking, I'm an IT group, but I have to start thinking about what does it cost? What is our internal investment to develop these products, deploy them, and support them? That's my cost of goods sold. That has to come into play when you start to try to figure out what are you going to sell it for. If you're
and also, like, if you're going to decide to do anything, folks need to go up and ask for budget. If you go up and say, I'm going to create this new data product, is going to generate $10 million this year.
Mm-hmm.
You guys have never done that before. The CFO may say, prove it. I don't know that I believe it, right? Mm-hmm. So if you can loosen the definition of kind of revenue, not to just kind of brand new cash for data, but mm-hmm. some other ways it's going to affect your churn or GRR, or get them to opt into additional products and services. I've seen a lot of people be pretty successful kind of framing in that way from a business value proposition as they go up to bring new products out to market.
Yeah. Especially if you're already offering that product internally, or a good portion of that, you can slight derivative if you're going to do it to the customer. It's like, turn your data and analytics program into a profit center, not a cost center. Yeah. Awesome.
We have one more coming in here, guys. It's a little bit of a topic switch. It's a people process question. What does adoption of a product management mindset really entail?
I'll take the first crack at that, Brian. I'd love to have your input on that. So I kind of alluded to this earlier, is if you're sitting on, when you look at all the data that's in your cloud data warehouse, and you've got data marts that you are offering to your customers, and you've got, kind of this integrated layer that is waiting for other people to come and explore and do things with. You have to, those are data sets, right? To go to a product management mindset, a big element of that, in my opinion, is you have to start thinking that your product has a life cycle. I developed the product, it's getting traction, it's generating value. Essentially, over time, things do change. So you built this product given the current conditions of markets and capabilities and needs and all that. Well, all of those external forces are going to change. And at some point, you're going to see erosion in the product. So you have to plan for that. You have to track it. And then when you see a product's usefulness starting to erode to the point where you have to ask yourself the question, is this still an asset, or are we heading towards it being a liability? And you need to be prepared to decommission that kind of product and roll out a new version of it, or a replacement to it. And then the other elements I talked about is it's not just the data, it's all the infrastructure around the data, the access methods, a surety of security and regulatory compliance, a surety of quality inside the data, right? What would you add to that, Brian?
I mean, I think you nailed it. Just, to me, product management just comes down to kind of value and prioritization. Here's the data, here's the value it's going to give your customers. What features of the data in the way I present it back out to those customers? How do I prioritize that? How do I package that? How do I create a kind of a good, better, best model that
Mhm.
will horse to water, so that they're not just using it, but they're using it more and more, and they're willing to pay more and more for it. So it's
Mhm.
kind of that fine balance of prioritizing things and doing that A/B testing, or understanding the value of whatever it is, so that you can kind of create that mousetrap for your customers, and really get them using your data, and so you become a indispensable kind of trusted advisor to them, where it's very hard for them to go somewhere else because they're so used to the data points that you provide them.
Mhm. Yeah, and final thought I have is, and beware, if you're the first one out there doing it, guarantee someone's going to take your idea and try to leapfrog you. So, monitor. Yeah.
Awesome. Great conversation, guys. This is fantastic. Any other final thoughts before I go through my marketing spiel of upcoming opportunities we have for our audience?
I think I'm square.
Yeah, one final thought I have is Brian, thank you so much. It was really enjoyable chatting with you today.
Yeah, no, likewise, Mike. I appreciate the invitation, and always great to talk about this stuff. I'm passionate about it. Been doing it for a long time.
Mhm.
Love it. All right, well, we've got a couple resources for the folks on the line. If you want to see the recording of this video or other videos, we've got a whole slew of content out on our YouTube channel. So you can find us at Great Data Minds there. In the chat, I've linked to a great article that Mike Lampa himself authored about data monetization and democratization. You can find that at hike2.com/resources and find it there. We've got another webinar coming up at the beginning of December that's about the shared responsibility model, and I've linked to that as well. And then from the ThoughtSpot side of the house, of course, if you're looking for more information on embedded analytics, you can go to thoughtspot.com/embedded. And finally, ThoughtSpot, I know, has a big in-person event coming up at the beginning of December. It's in New York City. It's embed focused, and so if you're interested in being considered for to get your way onto that VIP list, then I've shared a link there as well. And you can always, of course, reach out to us at info@hike2.com if you have any questions or want to discuss further any of these topics.
Yeah, that's
And
going to be
that's
a
all.
great event. That's at a 3 Michelin star restaurant called 11 Madison
Ooh.
Park.
Ooh.
So it's we have a couple CPOs, chief product officers, who are customers of ours, coming to speak, and then we actually are doing a similar bigger event in London focused on embedded analytics and data monetization on December 11th. So reach out to me, and would love to see you at any of those events.
Awesome.
Sounds amazing.
Mhm.
Cool. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. We wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.